And everyone, it's time for our last talk today, and it's going to be Kathleen Danielson telling us about how to avoid burnout and other essentials of open source self-care. Let's welcome her.
Hi. Oh, that was loud. I am Kathleen Danielson, and I'm going to talk about burnout. And I'm going to set my timer on my phone so I know what's going on, and set it on silent so you people don't tweet at me. Great. So just by way of introduction, my name is Kathleen. I'm Kathleen LD on Twitter. I am a developer advocate at an open source mapping lab called MapZen. At the moment, I'm also on the board of directors of the OpenStreetMap Foundation. I'm on the advisory board of the ADA initiative, and I am in the process of starting up a Geo meetup in Berlin, aptly named Geo Berlin. In the past, I also started and ran for 3 years a Geo meetup in DC, cleverly named GeoDC. And I also was on the board of OpenStreetMap US. I left this in here. I have given this talk in the past, and since the last time I gave it, this last item has changed. I am now paid to do open source, which is like super exciting. Yay! But I have that in there because there are some differences in the way that you deal with open source when you're paid or not. But still, a lot of the work that I do that I mentioned here is still volunteer work. I'm giving this talk because I needed to hear it. My areas of interest, the things that I talked about at conferences, really was a lot about open source community. It's still a lot about open source community. But what I found about a year ago was that I was incredibly burnt out. I was frustrated with the projects that I was working on. I had been kind of running things with different communities for some time, and I was frustrated. I was exhausted. I didn't really believe in what I was doing anymore. What I found really was that I was just very, very burnt out. Oh no, a cat break. These are my cats. I put some pictures of them in here throughout because I'm a lazy speaker, and this way there are comedic breaks that I don't have to come up with. So today in this talk, we're going to talk about what burnout is, why we should care, what causes it, how to keep from becoming burnt out, and then what to do if you are burnt out like I was. I also have a couple terms throughout this talk that I've highlighted, things that you may or may not already be familiar with that might be helpful to add to your vocabulary as you think about burnout and also your own mental health with regards to open source. So what is burnout? I asked a couple people on Twitter how they would define burnout, and I got a couple really nice responses. I won't necessarily read them to you, they're up behind me, but some of them were about when you kind of stop believing in the projects that you're working on. Others talked about the depletion of energy, either emotional or intellectual, and where it's really hard to kind of build that up again. Other people talked about the kind of the inability to recharge. If you take a normal weekend away on Monday morning, you're not back. You're not 100%. And other people talked about the way that you interact with the people around you, and how sometimes that can change and suffer. So what is burnout? The term burnout was a term that was coined in the 70s. It was started, initially it was used as something to refer to something experienced by people in helping professions. So people like nurses, doctors, teachers, therapists, people who are pouring a lot of emotional energy into the work that they're doing. The term has since expanded. It's much broader now. It kind of encompasses how people relate to their work in general. But that was really where the initial roots of it were. A couple caveats about burnout and also about the bias that I'm bringing to this talk. The DSM-5, which is the medical reference book for mental health professionals, does not have a diagnosis for burnout. So if you were to say to someone, I'm burnt out, particularly someone in like in a US context. If you were to say to them, "I'm burnt out," it's a little bit like saying, "I've had a mental breakdown." Clearly, something is happening there, but it's not 100% clear what that is. There's something, that could be made up of several different things. On the flip side, there's an international counterpart to the DSM-5, which is the ICD-10. That one does actually have a burnout. That does have a diagnosis for burnout. And you'll see actually in some other countries and cultures, they treat burnout differently. I live in Germany, for example, and there's a very standardized burnout diagnosis and treatment for it, which is a little different than what we have in the US. Another thing I wanted to mention is that burnout can very much include elements of anxiety and depression. A lot of the symptoms of burnout overlap very heavily, especially with symptoms of depression. For the context of this talk, they're not the same thing. I am not a mental health professional. I am not qualified to give talks on mental health, mental illnesses. But I wanted to mention this because there is a significant amount of overlap. They can happen together, and burnout in general can be hiding something larger. So that was something I kind of just wanted to put out there. I'm not going to dig into that really, but it's something that's pretty important to note. Okay, so what does it look like? Burnout can look different for everyone. Depends on your personality, your experiences, what's going on. The things that can be really common are things like increased irritability or cynicism. You're frustrated with your project and the work that you're doing. Maybe you're not very enthusiastic, something that you used to really care a lot about, you're not anymore. Maybe you lose empathy, especially if you're in kind of like a community maintenance role, or you're doing something where you're working with people in particular. You may get very frustrated with them and not really care about helping them in the way maybe that you used to. And then also simply decreased performance. The work you're doing is just not the quality that it used to be. But essentially, the main point here is that something changes. Something is different than it was before, and you're not happy with what's going on. Oh no, another cat break. Also me trying to learn German by annoying my cat. So who cares? Aside from the fact that I wanted to talk about my feelings, why am I bothering to give this talk? Why are any of you sitting in here? There are a couple reasons that burnout really matters in general and in FOSS in particular. In open source, you end up with problems of things like leader turnover. When our leaders in projects are burning out, they end up leaving, and you have unstable projects. You also end up losing people who are doing the less visible, less celebrated work. These are things like moderating mailing lists, running conferences, maintaining code, things that maybe are a little less glamorous, but really make up the infrastructure of the project that you're working on. Something that's also incredibly important to note is that open source doesn't have an HR department. There's no structure there to kind of look out for employees, or in this case, usually community members. So that means that there are things that we need to really be careful about and look out for ourselves and for each other, because there's no system in place to look out for that for us. And so then, kind of overall, we should care because we care about each other, and we care about ourselves, and we care about our own mental health, and we care about that of our peers. So where does it come from? What's causing it? The reason I want to talk about what causes it is that this ends up being the root of how you deal with it. If you can identify the risk factors or the things that are going to make you more likely to end up burnt out, you can start to figure out how to deal with that. You know what the warning signs are when you realize, ooh, you know what, I think that's kind of putting me in a bad position. I'm going to get a little bit burnt out there. It also helps you know how to start dealing with it when it's already happened and how to make sure it doesn't happen again. So the causes of burnout, and I'm going to spend a little while on these, and they're going to keep coming back. I want to talk about 4. Balance, expectations, pacing, and locus of control. Some of these, when I talk about them, will seem incredibly obvious, and some of them might be a little bit new. So this idea of balance seems pretty straightforward. Really, are you spending enough time not working? And this one can be really sneaky, especially with open source, because many times it's something you're doing after you're done with work. You go home from work and you spend a couple hours on this, so it's really something you're doing in your free time, but it ends up acting actually like a job. You have responsibilities and there are expectations, and it can end up being that you're spending a lot of your time working, really, even though several hours of that is your kind of hobby. Another way that I've kind of heard this idea expressed is, are you putting all of your happiness eggs in one basket? Basically, are the things that make you happy, that fulfill you, that really energize you, are they all kind of one thing? And if that one thing goes south, what happens? That something's going wrong, there's tension in a community, that becomes a really stressful, challenging thing for you. Do you have other things to fall back on, or is it just that? Is it just that community, just that project? That's something to be aware of. Another cause is expectations. And when you think about it, this one makes a lot of sense as well. So in the work that you're doing in your community, what do people expect of you? And then maybe even more importantly, what do you expect of yourself? And I think this one can be more important because it, again, is one that can be very sneaky. It can be hard to notice really what your own expectations of yourself are, and it can be very easy to project them onto other people. So sometimes you need to verify these assumptions externally and say, I'm hearing that you need me to do XYZ thing by Friday, is that true? And maybe it is, but maybe it's kind of you put these constraints on you. Another one is pacing. This one I think is incredibly important and super obvious once you think about it. Really just is the pace that you're working at, is that sustainable? Can you continue to work and do your full-time job as well as moderate 3 mailing lists and run a meetup every month and run a conference and work on some code as well? Maybe you can, but maybe you can't. And so I think one time when this becomes particularly challenging is when you're really excited about something because you want to take on things, you want to help, you want to get involved, and then suddenly you find out that you've gotten so many responsibilities that you can't take care of them all and do your work and have any time for yourself. Open source is a marathon and not a sprint, although there are sometimes sprints, but whatever. So you often will need to adjust the pace that you're working at if you want to keep doing it in any kind of long-term fashion. This last one I want to talk about is this idea of locus of control. When I first heard about it, it was sort of a foreign concept to me. But basically the idea is that everybody falls on the spectrum of an inner to an outer locus of control. If you've got an inner locus of control, you kind of see the things that are happening in your life as things that you can control, or you can do something about it. People with an outer locus of control tend to think more, they sort of see things from the perspective of these are things that are happening to me that I don't have control over. These are just the things that are happening in my life. It's probably not too surprising then that people with this outer locus of control, where things are happening to them, they tend to feel more powerless. When you have an inner locus of control, you tend to be more resilient. You can bounce back when things get challenging. So that one was a new idea to me. I'd never thought of things in that way. But when you start thinking about it, then you can start looking at, well, how am I approaching the things that are happening around me? Oh no, it's a Santa cat break. Look how angry he is. I do this every year. I enjoy it. All right, so great. Now we know all these academic things about burnout. What do we do about it? How do I keep from getting burnt out? Amazingly, they're the same things. So how do you avoid burnout? The same way that burnout happens. You need to be aware of your balance and your expectations and your pacing, your locus of control. You've got a lot of different tools that you can use to help you stay in a better position to really to be sure that you're practicing self-care in open source. These are things like having safe emotional distance, letting, when something goes wrong with a project, how much is that affecting you? How much are you able to distance yourself from that? Or is it kind of like wrecking your weekend? Can you kind of not separate yourself from that? Boundaries, having really healthy boundaries, learning when you need more boundaries and figuring out how to set them up and enforce them. Things like, I'm not going to respond to emails after 10 p.m. or 8 p.m., or I won't take part in open source work on Sundays. Anything like that, or saying, having this is the amount that I'm going to get involved, but any more than that is too much for me, and so I can't necessarily do that. Another thing in your toolbox is your teammates. Are they your coworkers? Are they people on the board with you? Are they project co-founders? These are people who can really help you figure out how you can distribute work properly. The word no is a really important part of your toolbox. Learn how to use it and how to say it. And then thinking about that idea of that happiness egg distribution. Are you putting all those happiness eggs in one basket? Are there other things that are kind of buoying you and keeping you afloat? Just a couple practical tips I'll go over quick. Things like, don't lead a community on your own. If you're running a meetup or a user group, have a co-organizer. Take time off. Take a sabbatical. It's even better if you can do this before you really need it. Asking for help from your co-organizers, asking for help from your community, spending time with other people, people who aren't a part of this community. Debriefing. This is one that I've talked to people where they, in their kind of leadership group, will take time regularly to debrief and sort of check in, see how things are going, and they're not talking about the project itself. They're really instead talking about how are you doing, how are you handling things, can we support you better? And then just being honest about your own risk factors. Like, what is it that that's really going to make you likely to end up being burnt out? So a lot of what I've talked about so far has been super high level, but I want to bring it back to open source. So I'm going to talk about a couple examples which I think will resonate with a lot of you as experiences that you've had or you've seen. So the first one, we talked about this a little already, this idea of a stealth job. When the open source work you're doing is masquerading as a hobby, you don't really realize that you've added on suddenly like 10, 15, 20 hours of work a week on top of your full-time job. So suddenly you can't figure out, well, I'm working really reasonable hours and I don't have energy. Like we were talking about before, the need for a work-life balance still very much applies. A way you might address this is working on your pacing. A sustainable pace, it may be different than what you were expecting. Where you thought you could run the meetup and plan the conference, maybe you need to step back from the meetup. If you want to do the conference, you may need somebody else to run the meetup. Just being really frank and honest about that. And then also, I think another thing that's really important is rethinking what you call downtime. If for you, downtime is responding to mailing list emails, maybe you need another downtime. I don't have a clever name for this one, but basically the idea is peers in different contexts. And this one you especially find when you've got people who are volunteering and working and doing it for work, kind of in the same environment. The problem here is that it's like when somebody is able to do this for work versus when someone's volunteering, is that it creates this big gap in pacing. And in expectations and in timelines and especially in reliability. There's this tension there, and that can create this kind of quiet, this really quiet challenge. What I actually found is I've often been on the volunteer side of this, talking with people who tend to be more on the paid side of it. It's actually usually not that people who are paid don't get that volunteers don't have as much time. For them, it tends to be reliability is what's really frustrating, that volunteers will say, I want to do this, or like, I'll do this by Friday, and then it doesn't get done. And I think that having been on the volunteer side, I think that actually then is about expectations, and the expectations we have of ourselves. And so I think people tend to say, I'll do this by Friday, hoping that they will and wanting to, but it's not necessarily realistic, and you've got other things to do and you can't get around to it. And so a way to mitigate this one is by talking about it, almost relentlessly. I think I've been in situations like this where really I needed to, we just need to talk about it and address, this is who has time to do what, and address it frequently. This also is a place where the idea of a meritocracy kind of breaks down. The idea that people who are the best at what they do are floating to the top doesn't really hold water when you're looking at somebody who's paid to do work versus if you're volunteering. If you're paid, you obviously have more energy and time to pour into something, and that doesn't really have anything to do with merit. Whew. Okay. Facepalm cat break. Okay, so the last one I want to talk about is something which is pretty common in open source, and I think many of you have probably dealt with this and experienced it. Sometimes there are just jerks in communities. Sometimes communities are just toxic, and that's so draining. I really do think, as an aside, that toxic people say much, much more about their communities than they do about themselves. And if, as communities, we are saying that, yes, you're a toxic person, but you're going to stay in this community, we're not going to kick you out, that says a lot about your priorities as a community. But these toxic communities can rapidly become abusive, really, often in quiet and very insidious ways. And this one's hard. If you can talk about it, that can help, especially if you find there are other people who are having similar experiences. If you're in a position of leadership, you might be able to institute cultural shifts, but sometimes you may just need to leave, and that's okay too, and we'll talk about that in a second. Okay, so that didn't work. We're burnt out. What do we do? I think the first step when you're burnt out, my own recommendation is to step back. Stepping back alone will not fix it, but it will give you the space to figure out what it is that went wrong. And once you've done that and started thinking about that, maybe you want to talk to people. And maybe it's people who aren't even really involved, but just sort of start sussing out, like, what was it that, how did you end up getting burnt out? And as you're ready, talk to more people, and then start figuring out, okay, maybe you're not all evil, and maybe I'm really exhausted. But sometimes the way you need to respond to burnout is just to leave, if necessary. This quote I'm going to read to you really quickly is, I think, a really powerful statement on something that we don't talk about much, which is leaving communities. Looking back, the reason I didn't leave my community sooner was because there's a giant social stigma around leaving an open source community. Open source is supposed to be our passion, something we work on even in our spare time. We talk about community, collaboration, and working on projects for the greater good. To walk away from an open source project for mental health reasons seems somehow selfish. The impact is that no one talks about leaving a community. The lack of people visibly leaving toxic open source projects means that people may not know leaving is a valid option. So if you do hear one thing I say, it's that you shouldn't compromise your own mental health for a toxic community. But actually, you shouldn't compromise your mental health for a non-toxic community. You really shouldn't be compromising your mental health for any community or project. Whew, okay, things are getting intense. So here are my cats when they became bipeds. Then they left. They didn't leave. Okay, so leaving a community, though, doesn't actually have to be the end. That might just mean you're leaving a committee, or you're stepping back from positions of responsibility. Maybe you're going to create a subgroup, maybe a women in blank group, or a local user group. That might be an option too. Or you could even fork the community. Sometimes that can work out really well. So what now? I think the question now is you have to ask yourself, how are you doing? And if the answer to that is, I don't think I'm burnt out, then that's awesome. But I would still encourage you to take a look and identify your own risk factors, find out ways to mitigate them so that you're taking care of yourself. And if the answer to that is that I am burnt out, I've been there, and it's awful, and it feels terrible. So when you've got the energy, maybe take a look at the things that caused it. Figure out how did you end up feeling burnt out? And then maybe start making some changes. But overall, be sure that you're taking care of yourself. Final cat break. But overall, I would recommend that you just try to be kind to yourself. Like we said, open source isn't something that has an HR department, so there's not a system in place to kind of take care of you. So you really need to make sure you're doing it yourself. nobody else can really take care of you for you. Thank you.
Thanks very, very much, Kathleen. That was great. So we have a few minutes for a couple of questions. I'm here at the mic in the center of the room. I also have a microphone that if you want me to come by, just flag me and I'll come by. Yeah.
Thanks so much for your talk. It's fantastic. It really resonates with how I've been feeling lately. I maintain way too many projects. And I've been thinking of starting kind of like a Maintainers Anonymous group. Have you ever done any kind of support group things? Hi, I'm such and such. I maintain all these projects. It's been 6 weeks since my last commit. Have you ever seen anything like that done work or not work?
Have I ever seen it, or have I seen it work?
Yeah, have you seen it?
I do not believe I have. I think people create their own sort of informal communities, particularly people who do community work tend to gravitate towards other people who do community work, and they find their sort of support structures that way.
Cool, thank you. Maybe a scheduled one would help me since I don't do it if it's not scheduled. Yeah, cool. Maybe I'll have those printers on.
Yeah, I'm in. So I just wanted to say that one of the things, I realized this week that I was burned out on my project and I started stepping back from it. And I realized that one of the things, the biggest pressures that I put on myself was coming to talks at PyCon, actually. And thinking about how if your community is healthy enough, you should be able to moderate your participation in it, and sort of convincing myself that my community wasn't healthy enough, and the answer to all of that was you need to do X and you need to do Y. And sort of got this lineup of I need to do all these things to make my community more healthy, then I can take a step back. So I just wanted to kind of identify that we can think about communities and talk about doing things for our communities too much, and that can actually be a source of burnout itself. So that's kind of what did it to me.
Cool.
Sorry that didn't end with a question.
Okay, thanks.
So you spoke at some point about there just being jerks in the community. Did you have, does that happen more with other developers or with the users of your project, or what, or both ends? Where do you see these jerks?
Jerks are community members, so it depends on the type of project. So I work with OpenStreetMap, which has a lot of developers, but also people who aren't developers who are map contributors to the map. And so I think that it can be anyone, really. It tends not to be end users because they aren't generally as invested in like the community and the project. But jerks can kind of come out anywhere. It tends to be because it is a community that because it's a community that is structureless, that sort of allows that to breed sometimes.
Okay, that's all the time we have for questions. Let's thank one more time. Really great. And that brings us to the end of the day. See you all tomorrow.